Alright, so let's have a look at these plain seams. So where I'm actually looking for the same thing on all four of these samples. So what I'm looking for is how straight your seam stitching is, how consistent the stitching is, and whether or not there's a back stitch at the beginning and the end. The other thing that's very crucial is the width of the stitching. To check the width of the seam, I would actually use a ruler, and I would actually put the ruler right up, and the way I would do it is I would check the width at the top, at the middle, and at the end. This one looks really good. So along those lines, even though that I would check it only in 3 spots, I'd actually kind of look at it just to kind of see if there was maybe a wavering stitch line. But again, that's grading in the concept of the straight line, your consistency of your straight line. So where I'm actually putting the ruler, up here at the beginning, I have a 1/4 inch. The middle, I have a 1/4 inch. And the end, I have a 1/4 inch. So that's full credit. I would do the same thing here. 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch. Everything looks consistent. Here we did 3/4 inch. So I'm looking for 3/4 inch, 3/4 inch, and 3/4 inch. And on this one, I'm looking for an inch. 1 inch at the top, 1 inch at the middle, and 1 inch at the bottom. All of these seams are consistent. Again, remember you're looking for a consistent stitch line, back stitching at the top and the bottom, or at the beginning and the end, and then also your consistency of the seam width. And remember, these are your plain seams, so even though we have these face sides together, we're not going to press them over because these are your plain seams to actually remind you what a 1/4, 1/2, 3/4, and 1 inch looks like. So there's one thing left to do, and that's actually to label these. And you can label them here all at the top. I'll do this one quickly so you can see what I mean. Or you can label it along the seam line. So I'm going to label this one 1/4 inch plain seam. Then my name. And then the date. All right. So that's one way you can label it. The other way you could label it is along the seam line. Not in the seam allowance, but along the part where we consider the garment. I would label this one's our 1/2 inch seam, so 1/2 inch plain seam. My name. And then the date. All right, so that's what I would be looking for if I were to be grading your pieces. And now once you have the other two labeled, remember you're going to label this one 3/4 and you'll label this one 1 inch. Once you have those labels, then they're ready to go into your notebook. Okay, so let's have a look at this cleaned seam. So remember, we sewed this at a 3/4 inch seam and then we turned under a 1/4 inch and stitched it down. So what would I be looking for? So the first thing I'd be looking at is the width of the seam. Is the width of the seam consistent? We want this to be a 1/2 inch, right? So just as I've done with the previous stitch line, we'd measure 1/2 inch at the top, a 1/2 inch on the middle, and then a 1/2 inch at the bottom. And I do that per side, per seam side. So 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch, 1/2 inch. So that's what I would be looking at. So if it all measures a 1/2 inch, that tells me that this was actually pressed under consistently. So the other thing that I would be looking at is consistent stitching. Is this consistently stitched in a nice straight line? And is the width of the stitch consistent from side to side of that seam allowance? It looked like I got a little careless here. I don't know how much I would actually take off for that. Maybe I just might circle it just to actually point it out. I may not actually take points off of that. But when I measured this seam here, I noticed that side to side it was a little bit less than a 1/2 inch. So it wasn't as consistent starting from the top to the bottom. So I might actually just put a little question mark under here, and that might just signify that I turned under too much. But it's really not that big a deal. At this end, because it's a cut end, it might be going into a seam. So that part might actually be in a seam and completely covered up. So if that's the case, we'll just keep our fingers crossed. So, but if this were actual school situation, I might actually just say a tiny bit off, kind of put a mark here, and I might take a quarter of a point off for the inconsistency, including this little stitch line. So see, I'm not perfect. So that's what I would be looking for. It's really, really close though. But of course, in this industry, we want to be as accurate as we can be. So now the other thing that we need to do before this is turned in, if you're in a school environment, is you need to label this. So we need to put the name of the sample, your name, and the date. So this is my cleaned seam. And we started with 3/4 inch, so we want to identify that. So I'm going to say 3/4 inch cleaned 1/2 inch. All right. Then I'm going to put my name and then the date. All right. And now once this is all done with that, you're ready to put this in your notebook. All right, so let's have a look at this 1/2 inch overlock closed seam. So what am I looking for? Again, the consistency of the stitch line, the consistency of the stitch length, and then of course the consistency of the seam allowance width from the seam line. Now remember that we overlocked this, and we originally started with a 1/2 inch seam allowance, which means that when we overlocked this, we couldn't cut anything off. If we cut any of that off, we would now have a smaller, more narrow seam allowance, and that's not what we want. When all is said and done and the garment is done, we still want this seam allowance to measure 1/2 inch. So what do? I'm going to measure starting at the top 1/2 inch, in the middle 1/2 inch, and then at the end 1/2 inch. And you may notice that I'm not actually using the thick line, I'm going by one of the skinny lines. So we could start with one of the thick lines as well. I'm getting a 1/2 inch, a 1/2 inch, and a 1/2 inch all the way down. We're looking for that consistency. And also we want to actually just kind of look at that overlock stitch, that it's nice and clean and that there are no extra little bubbles up here at the edge. So that looks nice, the stitching looks nice. So there's one last thing to do, and that's to label this, and I'm going to label this my 1/2 inch OVC seam. Remember, OVC is the abbreviation for overlock closed. And then I'm going to put my name and the date. And now this one is all ready to go into your notebook. Okay, so let's look at our busted open seam. So we have a 1/2 inch busted open seam, and we have a 3/4 inch busted open seam. Again, that's overlocked busted open on both of these. So again, we're going to look at the consistency of the stitching. So I would just kind of peer under here really quick, make sure that all of this stitching in here is consistent and that there is a back stitch at the beginning and the end. I wouldn't destroy your nice pressing job, but I would just kind of give a quick look under here to make sure that the stitching looks consistent and that the stitches are nice. So now the next thing I'm going to look at are the widths of the seam allowances. And remember, there are two sides, so I'm going to measure both. So I'm going to start up here at the top, and this one right up here, right away, it looks a little off. I'm about a 1/16 off. That means I cut something there. So I would probably take a 1/2 point off for that. But when I get to the center, it looks like I come back to that 1/2 inch. So it looks like that's been corrected. And I'm actually looking at this side of the seam allowance first, and the bottom actually looks pretty good. I've got a 1/2 inch there, that's consistent. So I'm going to look up here, starting on this side. I'm going to look at, I've got a 1/2 inch there. Then I'm going to look in the center, and it looks like I'm just a smidge off. And if you look at that visually, you can see the overlocking just dip in just a teensy bit. So I might just circle that area, and looking at it side to side, this looks just a tiny bit narrow than the other side. But it looks like it comes back to the 1/2 inch here. But then unfortunately, I may have gotten crazy and taken a little bit off at the bottom. So I'm a little consistent at the bottom on this side, and I'm a little inconsistent on the top on this side. So I might actually take a point off for that. And you can actually visually see that. So what I'm going to do, instead of turning this in, I'm actually going to go back and I'm going to do this sample all over again because I want that point. I'm going to do this sample again, making sure that my side to sides are consistent. And if you're in school, in a school environment, you would want to do that instead of turning this in. There's no use turning any work in that you know is not perfect and going to get you that point. So the same thing with the 3/4, exactly the same operation here. I'm going to look at 3/4 of an inch, and if you can see, I'm a little bit off here. I'm going to come back down here at a 3/4 inch. It looks like I'm okay here. And then at the very bottom, I've got 3/4 of an inch on this side. Now I'm going to look here on this side. I'm a little off here. Look at the middle, I'm on. 3/4 of an inch at the bottom. So it looks like I took a little bit off here at the top. So I can't remember if I started here or here. So, but these two sides, even though they're actually matching, they actually match, but they're a little cut off. So I might actually circle that and also take a point off for that. And so I might go back and do this one all over again completely, just making sure that I'm not cutting anything off when I'm doing my overlocking. So once you go back and redo your samples, if you need to, we're going to label them. So this is my 1/2 inch OVBO seam. Remember, that means overlocked, busted open. Then I'm going to put my name, and then the date. And I'm going to do the same for this one, except this one is going to be 3/4 inch, overlock, bust open, my name, and then the date. But remember, I'm going to go back and do these really quick so that I have perfect samples going in my notebook. Alright, so let's look at our top stitches. Remember, we had a single top stitch and we had a double top stitch. So just quickly, we can eye these top stitching. How consistent is the top stitching? This one looks pretty good, and I've got a back stitch at the beginning and the end. And then I'm going to look at the double top stitch and look at how consistent my stitch lines are away from that seam. And then, of course, the consistency of that stitch width here that I wanted, and everything looks good, and I've got back stitches at the beginning and the end. So now for the tricky part, and let's flip these over to the inside because we want to look at the inside. So we can actually look and see how consistent we are with the stitching. Now we see a little bit of discrepancy here, but that could have just been with the pressing. But if we turn to the other side, the stitching actually still looks consistent. So I wouldn't necessarily take any points off for that. So the stitching looks good on this one, but let's point out the overlocking for just a second. Now I don't know if this was just my machine, but the overlocking here seems to be a little bit inconsistent, a little off. So it could just be that I didn't have it set up correctly. I wouldn't take any points off for this, but I might just leave a little note on here that would be erasable to say, let's check the overlock attention. But on this one, it looks to be pretty consistent. So it may just been that one of the threads was out of the tension guide or something like that. So I wouldn't fault you for that. Both of these look very good. The only thing that we need to do now is to label them. And I would actually label them on the face side of the garment rather than the underside, because this is actually the name of the sample. We need to actually see what the outside of it looks like, what the outside of the sample looks like in this case. So I'm going to label this one. This was a 1/2 inch, right? So this is how I'm going to label it. So 1/2 inch. This is again overlock closed, OVC. And how many top stitches do I have here? I'm going to label this 1 TS, single top stitch. So you can write it out, but I want you to get used to actually seeing those abbreviations, because they're not going to write everything out in the industry. They're just going to say 1 TS. So it's a 1/2 inch, overlock closed, single top stitch. Then I've got my name, and then the date. All right, so what am I going to label this one? Almost the same thing. Again, this is a 1/2 inch, OVC, but in this case, I've got 2 rows of top stitching, so it's 2 TS. Then my name, and then the date. And now these are ready to go into your notebook. All right, so let's look at this French seam. So remember, this is the inside of the garment and this is the outside of the garment. So the first thing we want to do is kind of look that I would do is actually, I know this is a French seam. I would actually look at the outside of the garment and I would look for any little threads or fabric yarns or even part of that seam that we had trimmed away, just to see if it's peeking out of that seam. And it's not. This one looks very nice and it's a very nicely pressed seam. Then I would turn it to the inside and I would look at this seam, the first seam that we sewed, for the consistency of that fold, that it's folded over consistently, and that it looks nice and clean. And then it, of course, is pressed to one side. And then I would pick up my ruler and I'm going to look 1/4 inch. Is it close to that 1/4 inch? I do have close to the 1/4 inch. This one's slightly a little bit over. This one is a 1/4 inch. I've got a 1/4 inch right up here. It's a little bit over, but generally this is consistent. Now remember what I said. These notches, this notch up here, if I can move these threads, I need to trim those. I have a notch up here and then I have a notch down here. This is the actual final stitch line. So the fact that this might be a little bit over is not that big a deal. That just means when I sewed this original seam, I sewed it a little bit under a 1/4 inch, and that will be okay. As long as, you know, we know that this stitch line is consistent with these notches, because these notches are actually holding on to the size of the garment. So the other thing that I would look at is the consistency of the stitches and the stitch line. I have a little bit of a bowing here. I'm not too sure how that would affect it. Everything else looks pretty straight. I might just put a question mark on that. But I may actually go back and redo this again so I have a consistently straight line that goes straight, so I don't have any of this. However, when we look at the consistency of the stitches, a little bit of an issue here. I don't know if that was a bobbin issue or if I just kind of got out of control, so I might like circle that area. But all of the other stitches look fairly consistent. So because of these details, I might take off a 1/2 point. So I'm going to go back and redo this one so I have it perfect in my notebook, but I'm not going to throw this one away. I'm going to keep this one so that I can circle these little error areas that I need to remind myself about. So now that we have checked this and when to, if you need to redo your piece, we're going to label it. And I'm going to label this on the inside of the garment because this is the important part. Remember, the outside, all the seams are going to be closed. So the important part for me to look at is the inside and how this seam is finished. And this is our French seam. So label this French seam, your name, and the date. And all right, this is all ready to go into the notebook. I don't like having the reason. So let's look at the flat felt seam, and we're going to look at the face side and the inside of this one. So let's start with the face side since we have it here. Again, we're going to look at stitch consistency. Is the stitch length all consistent? Is it a straight line sewing on both of these sides all the way down? There's a little bit of a bobble like right around here and here toward the end. So that's something that we'll have to work on for the future. Now, what about the width between those stitch lines? Do you remember what those would be or what they should be? So remember that the two seam allowances, we had one that was larger and one that was smaller. The smaller one measured 3/8 and the larger measured 3/4. So 3/8 is 1/2 of 3/4, and remember that the 3/4 wrapped around the 3/8. So really, our stitch line, the distance between the stitch lines should be very close to 3/8. If they are not 3/8, they actually should be 3/8 rather than very close to 3/8. And I'm measuring 3/8 from the top to the bottom. And I do know, as I pointed out, there are some little bobbles here, some little stitching, so I might just circle those, and maybe I might take a little bit of a half point off and then say, if you want to do this again and you have better stitching here, then I'll give you that half point back, and I might actually go back and redo this. Now, I wouldn't rip these stitches out. What I would do is I would just cut out a whole new sample and redo the entire sample. The reason you wouldn't want to rip these out is because you would want to keep this in your notebook and just have that area circled so you know that those are the things that people would be looking for. And then, of course, doing it over again just reinforces your knowledge of how to do this sample. So now that we've looked at the outside of the garment, let's look at the inside of the garment. So remember, the inside of the garment should only have one stitch line. And again, from that edge, from this stitch line, remember, we press this over nicely. So I have a nice crease there, right? That's the end of my seam. And from that edge, I should be measuring about 3/8 of an inch. And it looks fairly consistent, although I do have, this is the top stitching if I fold this over. So you can see that stitch line that you're seeing on the inside is this top stitching. So we can actually better see any kind of inconsistency of those stitchings. So I might circle in a couple of spots, and then because I've seen it on this, you know what? I might actually take off a whole point because the stitching was really kind of inconsistent now that I can see it on the other side. So I might say, you know what? Are you sure you want to lose a point? Why not go ahead and do another one and see if you can get a better stitch consistency, and then turn that one in for full credit. Once you do that, then of course you would turn it in, and we're going to need to label this one. I have a little bit more room on this side, so I'm going to turn it this way. I'm going to label this. This is my flat felled. And my name. And then the date. And now, once you've got full credit and everything looks good, this is ready to go into the notebook. All right, so let's look at the curved and square corner seam. So let's look at the corner seam first. So let's turn this over to the inside. What I'd first look for is stitching consistency, right? With a pivot here in the corner. Back stitching at the end and the beginning. And then what I would do is I would just kind of turn this over, and then I would look at how consistent this line is. How nicely is it pressed? And then here in the corner, is this a nice clean corner? it looks pretty good, but I feel like maybe one stitch is a little bit out of place. I might be able to get that a little bit tighter. So I may go back and just try another round and see what I get. I can also flip this back very gently, and I can look at the clip here. And even though I clipped further, it does look a little bit like one stitch is slightly out of place. That maybe when I put the needle down and then I went under to clip and then I turned it, maybe that stitch was slightly a little out of place. Although this is still a good corner, so I may just kind of point that out to say, try this one more time and see if you can get a nicer corner, because it does kind of just ripple just slightly right here. Now, of course, this is muslin, cotton muslin, and it's really not that forgiving. Even though I tried to really press this out, these wrinkles are still kind of set in there. Now, if you, of course, had a nice wool, you could actually kind of press this out with the steam by manipulating those yarns, those wool yarns. You could actually steam this so it actually, those stitches wouldn't really matter, and you'd get a nice angle line here on the L here for the square. But this still looks pretty good for the stitching here on these lines. The sample was actually completed correctly. So again, this is the face side and this is the underside. Now I know some of you may have the tendency to want to go and overlock this, and I'm going to ask you try not to do that to overcome that, because this is, as a beginner, you want to keep this raw so that you can actually see your consistency of your stitch width, right? This was a 1/2 inch. This is supposed to be a 1/2 inch, so we've got a 1/2 inch all the way around. Keep that consistent, and also the overlocking may hide some of your actual work that you did. So you'll want to be able to go back and actually inspect this if you've forgotten how to do it. So one last thing is that we need to label it, and I'm going to label it probably over here on this edge. So this is our square corner seam. Let's put that here. And then, of course, you need your name and the date. All right, and this is all ready to go into your notebook. So now let's have a look at this curved seam. So we did a pretty good job. What I failed to realize when I marked the seam allowance, remember I went ahead and marked the seam allowance so we could see how close we got to that seam allowance. We did pretty good. Is that my markings were not made with erasable pen. So now I can actually see how far away I did not make it here. But if this was the seam going into another part of the garment and this was the seam, I'm really consistent with my 1/2 inch seam allowance. So here on the curve, this might just offer just a little bit of ease if that's in an area of the body that actually needs ease. So it probably wouldn't make that big a deal. The stitch line here looks like a good, consistent, nice curved line like the pattern had. But if I flip it over and I kind of look at the stitching here, I still get a good stitching here. I know it seems a little off right here, but if we look under here and we look at our fabric here, what we can do is, if you notice here, and I've grabbed my scissors, is that when we pull this back, the fabric is kind of pulling. So if it's doing that, it looks like the stitching is off. It looks like we could actually clip just a little bit closer to that stitch line to release some of that tension, and that's what I'm going to do. I'm just come in here, just clip just a little bit closer in those spots. And then what it does is it just kind of releases that tension a little bit. And in here, there might be a little tension here. We could make one more clip. I think I'm going to do this one, release some tension there and there. And now if we look at it, all that tension has been released, right? And now it lays a little bit flatter. And then of course we're going to check for 1/2 inch consistency all the way around, and it looks like I've got it. And I've got a back stitch at the beginning and the end, and all my stitches are all consistent. So this looks like, 100% here. And then I've repressed again. I know it looks like there's a little bit of wrinkles here. You could come under here, pull this back just slightly, and then press right under here, this area, to get rid of those. Now I know you're going to want, some of you may want to overlock this edge. I'm going to advise you to not do that on this piece. The reason is because it might hide all of the clip work that you did and all of your notes to yourself about how you actually sewed this together. So, and also if we're not well versed at overlocking, we might cut some of our seam allowance, and then all of our 1/2 inch goodness around this curve will go away. So for these beginner samples, I would advise not overlocking any of these seams. So now this one is actually looking really good. We just need to label it. And this is going to be labeled curved seam. And then, of course, as usual, put your name and then the date. And now this one is all ready to go into the notebook.